To the county, the Ellis estate was a paradise of prize-winning orchids, a symbol of high society perfection. But if you dug just an inch deeper, you would find that the beauty was fed by poison. I'm Margaret Ellis. My parents valued their reputation far more than they valued my dignity. I can still feel the cold gravel biting into my feet the day they threw me out simply for letting a flower wilt. Now they need my signature to sell the land and save themselves from destitution. They think I'm just a scientist here to test the dirt. They have no idea they've handed the shovel to the daughter they discarded. Most people think dirt is just dirt. They walk over it, they pave over it, and they forget about it. But if you hold a handful of soil up to your ear, really listen to the way it crumbles, it has a voice. It tells you if it's thirsty. It tells you if it's sick. It tells you if it has been mistreated. I have spent the last 10 years learning how to listen to the ground. My name is Margaret. Or as my clients know me, Dr. Ellis. I'm an agronomist. That's a fancy word for a soil scientist. When a farmer has a field that won't grow corn anymore, they call me. When a developer wants to build a subdivision on an old factory site, they call me to see if the ground is safe. I fix what other people have broken. My office reflects that. It is clean, quiet, and smells faintly of rain. I don't have pictures of family on my desk. I don't have holiday cards taped to the walls. Instead, I have shelves lined with mason jars. Each one contains a sample of earth from a different part of the state. Red clay from the south, rich black loam from the river valley, sandy silt from the coast. These jars are my company. They are honest. Soil doesn't lie to you. It doesn't pretend to be something it isn't. I wish I could say the same about the people who raised me. It's funny how a smell can take you back. Just this morning, I opened a sample jar from a client in the valley, and the scent of damp peat moss hit me. In a split second, I wasn't a 30-year-old scientist with a doctorate and a retirement account. I was 17 years old again. I was standing in the humid, suffocating heat of the Ellis family greenhouse. That was the place where it happened. The place where my life broke in two. My mother Evelyn loved her flowers more than she loved anything else. Certainly more than she loved me. To her, a perfect bloom was a sign of moral character. A wilted leaf was a personal failure. And the crown jewels of her collection were the cattleya orchids. It was the summer before my senior year. It was 98 degrees in the shade, and the humidity in that glass house was thick enough to chew on. The staff was off for the weekend, and my only job was to mist the orchids. But I was distracted. I had finals coming up. I was trying to secure a scholarship so I could go to a university far away from that stifling estate. I was studying calculus at the kitchen table, lost in numbers, and I forgot. I forgot for 2 days. When I remembered, my stomach dropped like a stone. I ran to the greenhouse. The heat lamps were ticking, a rhythmic, accusing sound. The orchids weren't dead. They were just tired. The petals were slightly drooping. The leaves had lost that waxy, artificial shine my mother prized so much. They were thirsty. That was all. But when my mother walked in, you would have thought I had committed a murder. She didn't yell. Evelyn Ellis never yelled. Yelling was for common people. Instead, she stood there in her pristine white linen dress, looking at the slightly drooping flowers. She reached out and touched a petal with the tip of her finger. "You are careless, Margaret," she whispered. The silence in the greenhouse was louder than a scream. "I gave you one responsibility, just one, and you ruined them." "They aren't ruined," I tried to say. "Water will bring them back." "The perfection is gone," she said, turning her back on me. "And so is my patience." She walked out. I didn't know it then, but she had gone to get my father. Arthur Ellis was a man who worried about two things: his money and his reputation. My mother's unhappiness was a threat to his peace, and I was the cause of her unhappiness. I remember standing in the foyer an hour later. My father held the heavy oak front door open. He didn't look at me. He looked at the driveway. "You don't appreciate what you have here," he said. His voice was flat, businesslike. "We have provided you with a life most children only dream of, and you repay us with neglect." "Where am I supposed to go?" I asked. I had one suitcase. It was packed with clothes I had bought with my allowance. "Figure it out," he said. "Maybe the real world will teach you the value of things." He didn't hit me, he didn't curse. He just closed the door. The sound of that latch clicking into place still haunts me. It was a heavy final thud. It was the sound of a vault closing. I walked down the driveway. I remember the physical sensation of the gravel through the thin soles of my canvas shoes. Every step hurt. I walked for 3 miles to the nearest gas station to use the payphone. I never went back. I never called. And they never came looking for me. That was 10 years ago. I survived. I waited tables, I took out loans, I studied until my eyes burned. I built a life out of dirt, the very thing my mother tried to wash off her hands. I thought I was done with them. I thought the Ellis estate was just a ghost story, I told myself when I couldn't sleep. But the past has a funny way of circling back. It started with a notification on my computer screen this morning. A high-priority request from a luxury real estate firm. They were looking for a rush job, a complete soil composition analysis for a high-value property entering the market. The listing price was $3 million. I clicked on the attachment purely out of professional habit. Then I saw the address. 404 Willow Creek Lane. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the screen, blinking, hoping I had misread it. I hadn't. It was my childhood home. The place where I was raised and the place where I was discarded. The request form was standard. The buyers wanted to ensure the agricultural value of the land. They wanted to know if the soil could still support the prize-winning gardens the estate was famous for. They had specifically requested my firm because of my reputation. They had no idea that Dr. Ellis was the girl who used to scrape her knees on that driveway. I sat there for a long time. The office was silent save for the hum of the air conditioner. My hand hovered over the mouse. I could decline. I could send a junior associate. I could pretend I never saw it. But then I thought about my father. I thought about his obsession with money. If they were selling the estate, something was wrong. You don't sell a $3 million legacy unless you have to. And deep down, a question began to form. A question I hadn't let myself ask for a decade. What happened to the garden? I picked up the phone and dialed the real estate agent. "This is Dr. Ellis." I said, my voice steady, professional, unrecognizable from the scared teenager I used to be. "I've reviewed the request for Willow Creek Lane. I'll take the job personally." I wasn't going back for revenge. I told myself that, and I almost believed it. I was going back because I'm a scientist and I had a job to do. But as I packed my gear, the auger, the sample bags, the testing kits, my hands were shaking. I was going home. And for the first time in my life, I held the power. If you believe that no child should ever be tossed aside like garbage by the people who are supposed to protect them, please hit the like button to show your support. The drive to the Ellis estate took 45 minutes. I spent the entire time gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My work truck is a beast, a heavy-duty Ford F-250 with a portable drilling rig mounted on the back. It's loud, it vibrates, and it smells like diesel. It is the exact opposite of the silent, pristine luxury sedans my father used to drive. When I turned off the main highway onto Willow Creek Lane, my heart hammered against my ribs. I expected the trees to look the same. I expected the towering oaks to cast the same long, intimidating shadows across the road. But as I rounded the final bend and the iron gates came into view, the breath went out of me. The gates were rusted. One side hung slightly off its hinges, looking like a broken wing. I slowed the truck to a crawl. The gravel driveway was still there, but the sound was different. When I walked away 10 years ago, the gravel was raked into perfect Zen-like patterns. Now my heavy tires chewed through ruts and potholes. Crunch, crunch, crunch. It sounded like bones breaking. I pulled up just short of the main house and killed the engine. The silence that followed was heavy. I sat there for a moment, just looking. The house was a sprawling colonial mansion. In my memory, it was blindingly white, a beacon of wealth sitting on a hill. Now the paint was peeling in long, sunburned strips. The color had faded to a dingy tooth yellow. A shutter on the second floor, my old bedroom window, was hanging crooked. But the real shock was the garden. The Golden Mile. As my mother used to call the row of rose bushes lining the drive, was gone. In its place were rows of brown brittle sticks jutting out of the hard earth. The lawn, once a carpet of emerald velvet, was patchy and choked with crabgrass. It wasn't just neglected. It looked exhausted. I saw movement on the porch. 2 figures stepped out from the shadow of the awning. My father, Arthur, and my mother, Evelyn. I reached for my sunglasses. I put them on, hiding my eyes. Then I reached for my hard hat. It was bright yellow, scuffed from years of field work. I put it on and adjusted the strap under my chin. I wasn't Margaret anymore. I was the contractor. I was the hired help. I rolled down the window just a crack to listen before I stepped out. They were arguing. Their voices drifted over the hot hood of my truck. "3 million is the floor, Evelyn," my father was saying. His voice had lost its boom. It sounded thin, scratchy. "The land alone is worth that. The agricultural zoning is the key. If we sell it as residential, we lose 40% to taxes." "Look at the place, Arthur Kane," my mother snapped. She was wearing a silk dress that looked 10 years out of date. She was clutching a glass of iced tea like a lifeline. "It's falling apart. If we don't get the cash by the end of the month, the bank isn't going to wait. They'll auction it." "They won't auction it," Arthur hissed. "The appraisal will save us. Once the soil report comes back clean, we prove the land is prime for commercial farming. A vineyard, maybe. Or an organic co-op. Investors eat that stuff up. We just need the paper that says the dirt is gold." I sat back in my seat. So that was it. They weren't selling because they wanted to downsize. They were selling because they were broke. The old money facade had finally cracked. They needed $3 million to pay off the debts and vanish into a retirement home before the neighbors found out they were destitute. And they needed me to sign the permission slip. I opened the door and stepped out. My work boots hit the gravel with a heavy thud. "Good morning," I called out. I kept my voice low, professional. I didn't smile. They stopped arguing instantly. They composed themselves. My father straightened his back, buttoning his blazer even though it was 80 degrees out. My mother smoothed her hair. It was a reflex. Appearance above all else. "You're late," my father said. He didn't say hello. He checked his watch. "The agency said you'd be here by 9. "It's 9:15, Mr. Ellis," I said. "Traffic on the bridge." I walked toward them, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps. I held a clipboard against my chest. I waited for a flicker of recognition, a gasp, a widening of the eyes. Nothing. They looked right at me, at my face, my chin, my nose, and they saw nothing. They saw a woman in work boots and a safety vest. To Arthur and Evelyn Ellis, people who wore safety vests were furniture. We were utilities. We didn't have names or histories. We just performed functions. "Well," Arthur said, waving a hand dismissively, "you're here now. I assume you know the reputation of this estate." "I've read the file," I said. It took every ounce of control to keep my voice steady. "Then you know this is premier agricultural land," Arthur said. He walked down one step, looming over me. He tried to be intimidating, but I noticed his cuffs were frayed. "For 30 years we produced the finest Cattleya orchids and hybrid tea roses in the state. The soil here is legendary." Is that so? I asked. I looked past him toward the withered rose bushes. It looks like it's seen better days. My mother scoffed. She took a sip of her tea, the ice cubes clinking. We've had a drought, she said sharply. And good help is impossible to find these days. People just don't want to work. They have no loyalty. The irony was so sharp I could taste blood in my mouth. Loyalty. I need to take core samples, I said, lifting the heavy auger from the back of the truck. I'll need to drill in 3 locations: the main garden, the greenhouse perimeter, and the lower field. Fine. Evelyn waved her hand. Just don't make a mess, and try to keep the noise down. I have a headache. I'll be as quick as I can, I said. I turned my back on them and walked toward the main garden beds. I felt their eyes boring into my back for a moment, judging my walk, my clothes. Then they lost interest. I heard the screen door squeak open and slam shut. They went back inside to the air conditioning, leaving the hired help to sweat in the sun. I set up the drill in the center of what used to be the prize begonia bed. The ground was hard. Not firm hard, it felt like concrete. I started the motor. The drill whined, a high-pitched mechanical scream that cut through the quiet morning. I pressed down, letting the spiral bit bite into the earth. Usually, when you drill into healthy garden soil, it yields. It's soft, aerated, full of life and moisture. The drill should sink in smoothly. This fought me. The machine shuddered in my hands. It kicked back, vibrating up my arms. The ground was dense, compacted. I had to put my full weight on the handle to force it down. When I finally pulled the auger up, bringing the core sample with it, I knelt down to inspect the dirt. I slid the cylinder of earth into a plastic tray. It wasn't black. It wasn't the rich chocolate brown of healthy humus. It was gray, a pale, sickly ash gray streaked with veins of unnatural yellow. I pulled off my glove and touched it. It was dry, crumbly, and felt gritty like sand mixed with chalk. There were no worms, no roots, no signs of life at all. Then the smell hit me. It wasn't the smell of rain or peat. It was a sharp chemical tang. It smelled like sulfur and old pennies. I frowned. This wasn't just drought. Drought makes soil dry. It doesn't turn it gray. This was chemical burn. I took a small vial of reagent from my kit, a simple pH tester, and dropped a pinch of the soil into it. I shook it. The liquid turned a violent, angry red instantly. Acidic. Incredibly acidic. Find anything interesting? I jumped. My father was standing behind me. He had come back out, likely to supervise. He was watching me closely, his eyes narrowed. There was a bead of sweat rolling down his temple. The pH is very low, I said, standing up. I kept my face neutral. Extremely acidic. Well, roses like acid, he said quickly. Too quickly. We used a lot of peat moss. Very organic. Yes, very natural. Did you? I asked. I looked him right in the eye. Did you use any synthetic boosters? Growth hormones? Nitrate accelerants? Arthur laughed. It was a hollow, booming sound that didn't reach his eyes. Heavens, no, we are purists, Dr. Ellis. Only the finest organic feeds. Manure, compost, bone meal. That's the secret to the Ellis legacy. Pure, clean earth. He was lying. I could see it in the way he shifted his weight. I could see it in the way his hand twitched at his side. He was terrified. And the greenhouse. I asked, looking toward the glass structure in the distance. The glass was clouded with grime. Did you use the same methods there? Identical, he said. Why do you ask? Is there a problem? I just need to be thorough, I said. The buyers are very particular about the long-term viability of the land. The land is fine, he snapped. The pleasant mask slipped for a second, revealing the angry, frightened man underneath. It just needs water. Just sign the report, say the composition is standard, and we can all get out of this heat. I can't just sign it. Mr. Ellis, I said, putting the gray soil into a labeled evidence bag. I have to analyze the samples in the lab. It takes 48 hours. He stared at the bag in my hand. He looked like he wanted to snatch it away from me. 48 hours, he muttered. Fine, but not a day later. We have a closing date to meet. I'll be in touch, I said. I packed up my gear. I took 2 more samples, one from the greenhouse, one from the field. They were all the same. Gray, lifeless, chemical. As I walked back to the truck, I saw my mother watching from the living room window. She was pulling back the curtain with one finger. She looked like a ghost trapped in a dying castle. I climbed into the cab and locked the door. I looked at the bag of gray dirt sitting on the passenger seat. My father hadn't just neglected the garden. He had tortured it. To get those prize-winning blooms to keep up the appearance of perfection, he had pumped the ground full of steroids and poison until the earth simply gave up and died. He had traded the future for a few years of glory. I started the engine. As I drove back down the driveway, leaving the dust and the lies behind me, I realized something. He had done the exact same thing to me. Have you ever dealt with relatives who care more about money and appearances than they do about their own family? Don't be shy to share your story in the comments below. I read every single one. 2 days later, I returned to the house on Willow Creek Lane. I didn't bring the truck this time. I drove my sedan. I didn't wear the hard hat or the vest. I wore a simple navy blazer and slacks. I carried a single thin manila folder. The front door was unlocked. I walked in. The foyer was exactly as I remembered it, grand, sweeping, imposing. But the sound was wrong. Tick, tock, tick, tock. The grandfather clock in the hallway was the only thing making a sound. It echoed. It echoed because the house was empty. The Persian rugs were gone. The antique side tables were gone. The paintings that used to line the walls, landscapes of the English countryside my mother adored, were gone, leaving behind pale, rectangular ghosts on the wallpaper where the sun hadn't touched for decades. They had sold everything. They were stripping the carcass before the animal was even dead. "In here," my father's voice called out. It came from the dining room. I walked down the hall. My heels clicked on the bare hardwood floor. Click, click, click. Arthur and Evelyn were standing in the middle of the dining room. The 12-seat mahogany table, the centerpiece of every Christmas dinner I was ever allowed to attend, was missing. The room was a cavern. Arthur was pacing. He looked tired. His skin was gray, matching the soil I had tested. Evelyn was standing by the window, looking out at the dead garden, her back to me. "You took your time," Arthur said. He didn't offer me a seat. There were no seats to offer. "The realtor has been calling me every hour. Do you have the certificate?" "I have the report," I said. My voice was calm, controlled. "Is it signed?" Arthur demanded. He held out a shaking hand. "Just give it to me. We need to fax it over before noon to lock in the escrow." I walked over to the only piece of furniture left in the room, a small folding card table set up in the corner. I placed the folder on it. "I can't sign this, Mr. Ellis," I said. Arthur froze. Evelyn turned around slowly, her face a mask of icy confusion. "What do you mean you can't sign it?" Arthur asked. His voice dropped an octave. It was the dangerous tone, the one he used right before he threw me out. "We paid your firm a retainer. You did the tests. Now sign the paper stating the land is agricultural grade." "I can't sign it because it would be perjury," I said, "and it would get people killed." "Don't be dramatic," Evelyn snapped. "It's just dirt." "No," I said. "It was dirt once. Now it's a sponge for heavy metals." I opened the folder. I pulled out 3 sheets of paper covered in red charts and black warning bars. I slid them across the card table. I ran the samples through the mass spectrometer twice. I said, "I wanted to be sure. I found high concentrations of nitrogen and phosphorus. That was expected. But I also found arsenic, lead, cadmium, and synthetic growth hormones that were banned by the EPA in the late 90s. Arthur stared at the papers. He didn't read them. He just stared at the red ink. "That's impossible," he whispered. "It's not impossible," I said. "It's inevitable. You wanted the biggest blooms in the county. You wanted the reddest roses and the rarest orchids. But nature has limits, Mr. Ellis. You didn't like those limits, so you forced them." I took a step closer. The air in the room felt thin electric. "You used industrial-grade chemical slurries," I said. "You poured them into the ground year after year. It worked for a while. It forced the plants to grow beyond their capacity. It made them look beautiful for the shows. But you didn't just feed them. You poisoned the water table." "We used organic feed," Arthur shouted. He slammed his hand on the flimsy card table. It jumped. "I told you, it was organic." "Lying to me doesn't change the molecular structure of the soil, Arthur," I said. "I dropped the Mr. Ellis." He didn't notice. "So what?" Evelyn stepped forward. Her eyes were hard, glittering beads. "So the soil is a little acidic. We'll throw some lime on it. Just sign the paper so we can sell the damn place." I looked at her. She really didn't understand. She thought the world bent to her will just because she demanded it. "You don't understand," I said. "You can't fix this with lime. The toxicity levels are 40 times the legal limit for agricultural zoning. You can't grow crops here. You can't graze animals here. You can't even build a playground here. If a child ate a handful of this dirt, they would go into organ failure." I paused. I let the silence stretch until the ticking of the clock in the hall sounded like a bomb countdown. "This land isn't an asset, Mrs. Ellis," I said softly. "It's a biohazard." Arthur's face went white. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying the land is worth 0. I said. "Actually, it's worth less than 0, because by law, as the current owners, you are responsible for the remediation. You have to clean it up. And based on these levels, the cleanup will cost approximately $4 million. The number hung in the air. $4 million. Arthur staggered back. He reached out and grabbed the windowsill to steady himself. "No," he wheezed. "No. The sale. The $3 million. "There is no sale," I said. "No bank will finance a loan on a toxic waste site. The property is unsellable." The reality hit them like a physical blow. The retirement, the nursing home, the escape from debt, it all evaporated in a single second. They weren't just broke. They were ruined. Then the shock turned to rage. Evelyn marched across the room. She stopped inches from my face. I could smell her perfume lavender and stale gin. "You incompetent little girl," she hissed. "You don't know what you're talking about. You're just some hired hand with a kit. Who are you to come into my home and tell me my garden is poison? We created beauty here. We created art." "You created a lie," I said. "Get out." Evelyn screamed. Her voice cracked shrill and ugly. "Get out of my house, I'll report you. I'll ruin your firm. You're nothing. You're just a dirty little digger, dirty little digger." It was the same tone she used 10 years ago. Careless. You ruin beautiful things. Something inside me snapped, but it wasn't a snap of anger. It was a snap of clarity. The fear I had carried for a decade, the fear of their judgment, their power, vanished. I looked at them. They weren't giants. They were just two scared, selfish old people standing in an empty room. I reached up and took off my glasses. I folded them slowly. I placed them in my pocket. I reached up and pulled the hair tie from my hair, letting it fall around my shoulders. I looked at Evelyn. I looked directly into her eyes. "You're right," I said. My voice changed. I dropped the professional cadence. I spoke with the voice of the daughter who used to sit at this table. "I am a digger. I dig for the truth. That's something you never did." Evelyn blinked. She stepped back, frowning. She looked at my face, really looked at it for the first time since I walked in the door. And as for ruining beautiful things, I continued, I think we're even. I killed some orchids because I was tired. You killed this entire estate because you were greedy. Arthur turned from the window. He squinted at me. Who are you? I turned to him. You told me to go figure it out. I said, you told me the real world would teach me the value of things. Do you remember that Father Missa? Arthur's mouth opened. No sound came out. It did. I said, the world taught me that things only have value if they're real. And it taught me that you don't throw people away just because they make a mistake. Evelyn let out a sound, a sharp, strangled gasp. Her hand flew to her mouth. She stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. Margaret, she whispered. Hello, Mother? I said. The silence that followed was absolute. Arthur looked from me to the report on the table and then back to me. The color drained from his face completely. He realized who held the gun. He realized who held the only copy of the report that condemned them to poverty. Margaret, Arthur stammered. He took a step toward me, his hands shaking. Margaret, we didn't know. You didn't look, I said. This report, Arthur said, pointing a trembling finger at the red charts. You can change it. You're the scientist. You can fix the numbers. Margaret, please. We're family. I looked at the man who had closed the heavy oak door in my face. I looked at the woman who had watched him do it. Family, I asked. Family doesn't poison the ground they stand on. I picked up the folder. I turned around and walked toward the door. Where are you going? Evelyn screamed. Margaret, you can't leave us with this. I stopped in the doorway. I didn't look back. I have to file the report with the county, I said. It's the law. Margaret, Arthur shouted. It was a beg, a desperate, pathetic plea. I kept walking. The sound of my heels on the hardwood floor was the only answer they got. Click, click, click. I walked to the front door, my hand hovering over the brass knob. My heart was pounding, but not from fear. It was the adrenaline of finally saying the words I had held back for a decade. Behind me, the silence in the dining room had shattered. We can fix this. Arthur's voice was frantic, rising in pitch. Margaret, wait! Don't open that door! I stopped. I turned around slowly. Arthur was scrambling toward me. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. The imperious patriarch was gone. In his place was a desperate man in a frayed suit sweating through his shirt. We can work something out, he stammered, stopping a few feet away. He held his hands up, palms open. You said the cleanup costs $4 million, but maybe we can just sell the house. Forget the land. We'll sell the house for a loss. Just don't file the report. I looked at him with a mix of pity and disgust. You can't separate the house from the land, Arthur, I said. The well water draws from that soil. The basement foundation sits in that soil. It's all one sick organism. Evelyn was still standing by the window, her back rigid, but I could see her shoulders shaking. She wasn't crying. She was hyperventilating. We have nothing, she whispered. Her voice was thin like dry paper tearing. The bank has already sent the foreclosure notice. We were counting on the sale to pay off the mortgage and the credit cards. If this report goes public, we will be on the street. She turned around. Her face was streaked with tears, her makeup running in dark, ugly lines. We're family, Margaret, she sobbed. You can't do this to your own flesh and blood. You can't let us become homeless. I let out a short, dry laugh. It echoed in the empty hall. Family, I asked. You threw your flesh and blood out on the street because she forgot to water a plant. You didn't care if I was homeless then. You didn't care if I was hungry. You told me to figure it out. That was different. Evelyn cried. You were young. You were resilient, we are old. And whose fault is that? I asked. You had 30 years to build a life. Instead, you built a stage set, and now the curtain is coming down. I put my hand on the doorknob again. I'm not doing this to you, I said quietly. You did this to yourselves? I'm just the messenger. I opened the door. Standing on the porch was a man in a gray state uniform. He was holding a clipboard and looking at the withered rose bushes with a frown. It was Mr. Henderson. I had called him yesterday as soon as the lab results came back. I knew that my word alone wouldn't be enough. My parents would argue, they would litigate, they would lie. I needed the finality of the law. Henderson looked up as the door opened. He was a thick, sturdy man with a face like a bulldog and eyes that didn't miss a thing. Dr. Ellis, he asked, nodding to me. Mr. Henderson, I said. Thank you for coming on such short notice. Arthur and Evelyn froze. They stared at the man in the uniform like he was the Grim Reaper. Who is this? Arthur demanded, his voice trembling. Who did you call the State Environmental Protection? Henderson said, stepping into the foyer without waiting for an invitation. He didn't wipe his boots. He looked around the empty house, unimpressed by the molding or the chandelier. I received a report of significant soil contamination at this address. Henderson said, his voice flat and official. Dr. Ellis provided me with the preliminary data. I'm here to confirm the site status. You have no right, Arthur sputtered. This is private property. Not when you're leaching arsenic into the county water table, it isn't, Henderson said. He pulled a device from his belt, a heavy-duty Geiger counter for chemical volatility. If the readings match the report, I'm placing a condemned notice on the agricultural zoning, effective immediately. He walked past Arthur, straight through the dining room and out the back door into the garden. We followed him. We had no choice. The sun was high now, beating down on the brown earth. Henderson walked to the center of the prize garden bed. He stuck the probe into the ground. The machine beeped. Once, twice. Then it let out a long, steady, high-pitched whine. Henderson looked at the readout. He shook his head. Lord have mercy, he muttered. You people really cooked this place. He turned to Arthur. This land is dead, Mr. Ellis. You've got lead levels here that would shut down a factory, let alone a farm. I'm flagging this property in the state database. As of this moment, you cannot sell, transfer, or develop this land until a certified remediation plan is completed and signed off by the state. Arthur collapsed. He didn't faint, he just crumpled. His legs gave out and he sat down hard on the dry, dead grass. He put his head in his hands. It's over, he moaned. It's all over. Evelyn was staring at the house, the grand peeling mansion that had been her identity for 40 years. They'll take it, she whispered. The bank will take it. And we have nowhere to go. She looked at me. For the first time, there was no anger in her eyes, no arrogance, just pure, naked terror. Margaret, she said. Her voice was barely audible. Please, we have no money. We have no friends. Everyone we know, they only liked us for the parties. If we lose this house, we die on the street. I looked at them. I looked at my father weeping into his hands. I looked at my mother clutching her pearls as if they could save her. I looked at Mr. Henderson, who was busy writing up the citation that would seal their fate. I had won. This was the moment I had dreamed of for 10 years. The justice was poetic. The people who valued things over people were losing their things. The people who abandoned their child were now the ones being abandoned. I should have felt triumphant. I should have felt a surge of victory. But I didn't. I just felt tired. I looked at the ground, at the gray, dusty soil that had caused all this pain. It wasn't the soil's fault. It was just doing what it was forced to do. And these two old people, they were toxic, yes. They were broken, but they were also pathetic. If I walked away now, I would be leaving them to die. I would be doing exactly what they did to me. I took a deep breath. The air smelled of dry grass and impending rain. "Mr. Henderson," I said. The inspector looked up from his clipboard. "Yeah, Doc." "Don't file the condemnation order yet," I said. Arthur's head snapped up. Evelyn's eyes widened. "The law says the owners have 30 days to present a remediation plan," I said. "If a plan is filed and approved, the status remains pending rather than condemned. Is that correct?" "Technically." Henderson scratched his chin. "But who's going to file a plan for this mess? You're talking years of work. Specialized biological treatment. It's a fortune." "I know," I said. I looked at my parents. "I have a plan," I said. I bet they didn't see that coming. "Let me know in the comments if you guessed who Mr. Henderson was." "I have a plan," I repeated. The words hung in the humid air between us. Mr. Henderson lowered his clipboard. He looked at me over the rim of his glasses, his eyebrows pulled together in a deep V. "Doc," he said, his voice low and gritty. "You know what remediation involves. We're not talking about a weekend project. We're talking about bioextraction. We're talking about stripping the topsoil. It's expensive and it's grueling. Why would you put yourself on the hook for a mess you didn't make?" I looked at Arthur and Evelyn. They were huddled together on the porch steps, looking like two children who had broken a vase and were waiting for the punishment. They were terrified. They were selfish. They were weak. And if I walked away, they would be destroyed. "Because," I said, looking at the dead gray earth beneath my boots, "I don't like leaving things broken." I walked over to them. I didn't sit down. I stood over them, casting a shadow that covered them both. "Here's the deal," I said. My voice was hard. There was no warmth in it, only clarity. "Mr. Henderson will file the status as pending remediation. That stops the condemnation order. It keeps the bank from seizing the house immediately." Arthur let out a sob of relief. "Thank you, Margaret. Thank you. I knew you. I'm not finished." I cut him off. He snapped his mouth shut. "I will cover the cost of the materials," I said. "I will provide the labor. I will use my firm's proprietary fungal treatments to leach the arsenic out of the ground. It will take 3 years, maybe 4. 4 years, Evelyn whispered. "But how will we live?" "You will live here," I said. "You will live in the house. You will have a roof over your heads, but you will not be in charge." I reached into my bag and pulled out a notepad. I scribbled a few lines on it. "I require full legal power of attorney over the estate," I said, "for the duration of the cleanup. You don't make decisions about the land. You don't talk to the realtors. You don't touch a single shovel. If I say we plant clover, we plant clover. If I say we plant sunflowers, we plant sunflowers. You are tenants in my garden. Do you understand?" Arthur looked at Evelyn. The old Arthur would have raged. He would have talked about dignity and ownership. But the man sitting on the porch had no dignity left. He nodded slowly. "We understand," he whispered. "Good," I said. I turned to Henderson. "Draw up the paperwork. I'll sign as the guarantor." Henderson shook his head, a small begrudging smile on his face. "You're a better woman than me, Dr. Ellis. I'll give you 30 days to break ground." Fin Tiem. The next 3 years were the hardest work of my life. Revenge is fast. It's a flash of anger, a shouted word, a slammed door. Revenge is like the chemical fertilizers my father used. It gives you a quick rush of satisfaction, but it leaves the ground scorched. Mercy is slow. Mercy is a grind. I spent my weekends at the estate. I didn't sleep in the house. I slept in a camper trailer I parked in the driveway. I couldn't bear to be inside those walls listening to the ghosts of my childhood. I started with mushrooms. We drilled thousands of holes into the hard pan soil and injected mycelium spores, a specific strain of fungi that eats heavy metals. For the first year, the estate didn't look like a garden. It looked like a science experiment. It was covered in white, fuzzy mats of fungus. My mother hated it. She would watch me from the window, her face pinched with disapproval. She wanted roses. She wanted beauty. "It smells like a cellar out there," she complained one afternoon when I came to the back door to check the water meter. "It smells like life," I told her, wiping mud from my cheek. "The fungi are digesting the poison you poured into the ground. Let them eat." By the second year, the gray soil began to turn brown. The smell of sulfur faded, replaced by the rich, damp scent of decay and rebirth. We planted the cover crops next. Clover, vetch, plants that pull nitrogen from the air and push it back into the earth. And then the sunflowers, thousands of them. We planted an acre of sunflowers because they are hyperaccumulators. Their roots suck up lead and store it in the stalks. When they bloomed that third summer, the estate was transformed. It wasn't the manicured artificial perfection of my father's orchids. It was wild. It was a riot of yellow heads nodding in the wind. It was messy and loud and alive. I saw my father walking among them one day. He reached out and touched a rough, hairy stalk. He looked confused, as if he couldn't understand how something so common could be so strong. He never picked up a shovel. He never offered to help. He and Evelyn stayed inside watching TV, aging rapidly, living in the safety bubble I had built for them. They never said thank you, not once. But I didn't do it for their gratitude. I did it for the dirt. 3 years and 2 months after I arrived, Mr. Henderson came back. He took his samples. He ran his tests. He walked the perimeter of the sunflower field, whistling a low tune. He met me by the truck. "You did it, Doc," he said. "Lead levels are negligible. Arsenic is below the safety threshold. The land is clean." I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding since I was 17. We put the house on the market the next week. It didn't sell for $3 million. The market had cooled and the house itself was still in disrepair. But the land, the certified organic rehabilitated land, was valuable. A local vineyard bought it for $800,000. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough. I used the money to secure a suite for my parents in a reputable assisted living facility in the next town over. It was clean. It was safe. They would have meals cooked for them and staff to attend to them. They would never be homeless. On moving day, I stood by the car as the movers loaded the last of their boxes. Evelyn sat in the passenger seat. She looked frail. Her memory was starting to slip. She looked out the window at the field of sunflowers one last time. "It's a shame about the orchids," she said softly. "They really were beautiful." "Yes," I said. "They were." Arthur walked around the car. He stopped in front of me. He looked older, smaller. His shoulders stooped. He looked at me, and for a second I thought he might say it. I thought he might say he was sorry. "You're a good technician, Margaret," he said. "You know your trade." I smiled. It was a genuine smile because I realized it didn't matter. His approval was a currency that had no value anymore. "Goodbye, Arthur," I said. "Take care of Mother." I watched them drive away. The car disappeared down the long, winding road, kicking up a small cloud of dust. I was alone. I walked back to the garden. I knelt down and dug my hands into the soil. It was cool and damp. It crumbled perfectly between my fingers, dark and rich. It was ready for whatever came next. Vines, wheat, trees. It didn't matter. The poison was gone. I had saved them. But more importantly, I had saved myself. I hadn't let their bitterness turn me into something hard and gray. I had remained fertile. I had remained useful. I stood up and wiped my hands on my jeans. The sun was setting, casting a long golden light over the sunflowers. Revenge is like those chemicals my father used. It looks strong, but it poisons the ground you stand on. It seeps into the water, and it kills everything it touches. Mercy is the hard work. It's the digging, the turning, the waiting. It's sweaty, and it's dirty, and it takes years. It doesn't give you a trophy. But when you're done, the earth is clean again. You can breathe the air. You can plant new seeds. And finally, for the first time in a long time, you can sleep. Thank you for spending time with us today. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us tell more stories like this. See you in the next video. That brings Margaret's journey to a close. Have you ever had to choose between mercy and revenge with your own family? Don't be shy about sharing your thoughts in the comments. Your story might be the inspiration for our future episodes. We read every single comment. We truly appreciate you being here. There are even more captivating stories waiting for you right on your screen. Please click one now so you don't miss the ending. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. This has been a story from Ashes of Revenge. We'll see you next time.